You guys have all seen the destruction that water can cause. Right? We're coming up here and they're still working on the road. They got rocks now over here. Water is one of the most destructive forces on the planet. It can displace anything. It can displace rock, metal. I remember when I lived in Korea, they had to put these, I guess these flood, I don't know what you call them, but they were like channels, these concrete, like they look like where you have a creek or a river go through. Because they said they had a flood so bad that it moved tanks. Now a tank is a heavy equipment. They said that the flood was so bad it took a tank and it was just going down with the water. Water is very, very, very destructive. And even a little bit adds into other little bits and they form a flood and it'll just clean out anything. You know, we used to get floods when I grew up in Kentucky and we had a little creek. And the creek typically would have, 3 or 4 inches of water at any given time. But then the flood would come, a lot of rain, and it would be 3 or 4 feet deep. And you go down after the flood and the whole creek bed was cleaned out. I mean, it was just perfectly clean. It moved everything. It moved all the dead branches. It moved rocks. It moved everything out. Very, very destructive. The only thing more destructive than water is what? Fire. Fire. Water displaces things. Fire burns them up. It removes them. But today we're going to talk about the ark. The ark. And I want to talk a little bit about Noah's time on the planet. Now, if we look at our world and we see the way things are, we think pretty bad, right? We constantly ask ourselves, can it get any worse? Can people get any more belligerent or more hateful? Can there be any more wars that, more so than we've already had or we're already experiencing? We're in constant tension with somebody or somebodies. And we think, how bad can the world get? Now imagine a time in our history where it was so bad that God regretted making it. Now God is not to that point yet with our current world. So imagine how bad it must have been for God to have said, I want to destroy it. Again, we look at the state of our world now and think, if God doesn't do it in the current situation, at what point does it have to get for Him to think that way? But this is the way it was in Noah's time. Is that God was preparing to destroy the planet. If you would turn with me to Genesis chapter 6, starting with verse 13. It's kind of a long passage here, but just bear with me. Genesis 6:13, and this describes the conversation that God is having with Noah concerning the things of the earth and what His plan is. Verse 13 says, And God said to Noah, The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. He wasn't just destroying the people. He was destroying the planet. It says, Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you shall make it. Now I want to stop here because this is interesting, because you guys may or may not have remembered this message. It's probably a couple years ago, but do you remember when Jesus and the disciples, remember they were on a hill and they had thousands of people sitting there. They started to get hungry. You remember that? You remember when the disciples said, well, what should we do? And Jesus said, you feed them. You remember that? I love that. He didn't say, I'll feed them. You feed them. And here God is saying, you make an ark. I'm not going to make it for you, but here I'm going to tell you how to make it. And this is what I love about God, is God gives us the provision. God is the one backing it. But He expects us to do the work. Or at least some of it. So continue on. It says, And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark in its side. You shall make it with the lower, second, and third decks. I love this because no ship has ever been created like this before. And God is giving him the pattern. He's telling him how to build it. Remember we talked a little bit last week that God, when He needs to be particular, He is. He tells you how to do it. And when we follow His instructions to the letter, what happens? Good things. He blesses it. So here God is giving him a pattern of how to build the ark. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. Now there are people that will claim that God never does destruction, that destruction is caused by sin. Now granted, this is the byproduct of sin. But God says in this verse, who's bringing the floodwaters? He is. He is. He's bringing the floodwaters to destroy the earth. We'll continue on. It said, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of all the birds after their kind, of animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing on the earth after its kind. 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. And you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and shall gather it for yourself, and it shall be food for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God commanded him. So he did. Now continue on in chapter 7. Then the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Now then he clarifies here the animals that need to come in. He said, you shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female, and 7 each of birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. You know, it always amazes me that, you know, when modern science is so anti-God, but God is the ultimate scientist. He knows what needs to be done to preserve life on this planet. And He knows that He's built into the DNA of each of these animals the ability to propagate and again become more diverse over time. Because we obviously see more diversity now than what was left on the ark. It says, for after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters were on the earth. Now, can you imagine the message given to Noah? I want you to imagine for a second you have 10 children. 10 children. And you say to the first one, I've regretted having you. All of you. And I'm going to destroy all of you. Can you imagine saying that to your children? That his heart is heavy because he looks at the earth and thinks, I regret ever even making the planet. Now God is a God of creation. He is not a God of destruction. For God to get to the point where He's sorry He made you, He was grieved. This is not an act of, you know, sometimes we make we call it the Old Testament God, an angry God. This is not an angry God. This is a sad God. He's looking at the earth thinking, I made this perfect for you. I gave you everything and this is what you've done to it. And He was sad, and so He gives this message to Noah, and you can imagine Noah hearing it thinking, God is grieved. That's the word it uses, grieved. He's sad that He made it. And He puts Noah in charge. And Noah, one of the greatest commissions ever given to any one person on the planet was Noah was put in charge of saving what was left of humanity, was saving what was left of the animals. That's pretty amazing. You can imagine the task that's for 120 years as He's building the ark, that He has tasked with making sure that the earth survives past the destruction that God's going to bring. Do you think that's a heavy heart? Now, friends, you know we're tasked with a similar thing. We are tasked with a message to bring to survivors of this planet, the ones that are going to survive into eternity. That's part of our commission, right? We're to give the gospel message to people and bring them into eternity with us. And so Noah was given this very heavy task of having to preserve what was left of the human species and what's left of the animals. Of course, God gave him the pattern. God didn't say, figure it out. You got 120 years. Surely that's enough time. You know. Takes you 20 years to build the first one. Not quite right. Let me try it again. And, trial and error. I'm a computer guy, and sometimes trial and error is the only way I can fix something, because I have to try it first, it breaks, and I try it again, and eventually I get it right. God spelled it out for him. God knew the dimensions, the type of wood that would survive. He knew how to build a boat so it would float. Again, they did not have these ships back then. You can imagine our modern ships wouldn't survive it. If you guys have seen some of these bigger ships that we've had, and they have every possible advantage. They have GPS, they have computerized motors, they have all these things, stabilizers to keep them afloat. And yet what happens? In rough seas, they turn over. I was watching one, these big cruise ships, and they have, again, the top of the line, every possible technological thing we can put on it to keep it from, having problems. And even then, they still run into issues. And we'll lose one, or it'll sink. The Titanic being a great example. The biggest ship ever built at that time. And it sunk. But God gave them a pattern. And it was a good pattern. One of the interesting things about Noah and the ark, and I always mention this to my brothers and sisters who claim that the Levitical laws for eating only pertain to Jews. I always ask them, was Noah a Jew? No, he was before that. Then how did he know what was unclean? Remember, there were 2 of each animal, of the unclean, a male and a female. There were 7 of the clean. Why were there 7? Yes, one was for the altar. There was some for them to eat. And then the others were for survival. Now imagine if you like pork chops. And you said, that Old Testament stuff's for the Jews. I want my bacon. You cut them up. You put them in the emu, right? You get your lau. And all of a sudden, there's none left. Right? There's none left. The unclean animal species is done. But God created them for a reason. God created them not to eat, but God created them to have a purpose. And so fortunately, Noah knew what clean and unclean was. And so you had this mixture on the ark of clean animals and unclean animals. One of the more interesting observations of this story is God tells him to gather food, and it will be for you and for them. So they actually shared the same food. Vegetarian food, right? So all the animals, clean, unclean, and the humans ate from the same food store. Now, did the waters overcome the ark? Did God give him a good pattern to build? We're here today because he was obedient. So when you build it to God's specifications, it will last. If you don't, and I always joke about this, if he had said, you know what, God, I appreciate your pattern, but I was kind of looking it over. And you know, on page 3, when you say to build it this way, I was kind of thinking, you know, I got a lot of experience with wood. And I was thinking if I put this here and change this around here, and maybe put an extra window in, that might work a little bit better. If he had done that, would it have survived? No. Right? Because there's certain things God doesn't give us leeway in. We talked about this last week, you know, when we talked about that God choose the colors of the church, or did He say you guys choose it? Whatever you guys decide on and you guys like as a church, then put it in there. If you like red, if you like blue, whatever. But there's other things that God says, I need you to do it this way, and you need to trust me on it because this is what needs to be done. And fortunately, Noah was obedient, and he didn't insert himself into the plans. Now, when God wiped the earth with the floodwaters, everything was destroyed. When you read how it happened, water came from the ground. There had never been rain on the planet. So water came, it said it burst forth the seams of the earth. So you had a water table underneath coming up, and you had rain coming down. We believe that it displaced islands, that it displaced mountains, that the surface of the whole planet was completely changed from what it was prior to that. And yet the wooden boat survived it. Now, can you imagine being in the ark? Can you imagine the shaking, the rattling? I don't like flying. And even the slightest bump, I'm grabbing my wife. I love you, baby. I'll see you in glory. Right? Can you imagine? Now, she knows it's true. I'll grab her hand. I hate it. I really do hate flying. But you can imagine being in a wooden boat when the planet of the earth, the whole planet is being destroyed. The noises, the sound, the rushing water. I mean, I get a little freaked out if I hear, like a rushing river. We get floods, especially like Kauai, where, it comes down from the mountain and all of a sudden you see this flash flood coming and you see this water coming. It's so scary, right? And you can imagine, again, the whole planet is being destroyed. That's a lot of water. That's a lot of noise. As it starts to rain and the floods start coming through and it starts to wipe out plants and animals, you hear your neighbors screaming, the ones that didn't want to get on the boat, your fellow church members, the conference office that got wiped away, that wasn't on the boat. It had to have been scary. You had to know, you had to trust the Lord implicitly that He's going to get you through this. You can imagine the animals may not have been that happy about it either. I know my puppy, when she hears something outside, she's, what's going on? You can imagine hearing all that, and to put them at ease. I know Sister White talks a little bit about that, about, the animals being at ease because God took care of them. But the fact is that they were on this boat for what? What was the purpose of the ark and them being in it? It was to save them. The purpose was salvation. But salvation would come at the end of the journey. They had to go through it. God did not take them out of the situation and move them over here. A lot of Christians teach and preach that in the end times God will remove us. That is not how God works. Because God's glory is manifested when His people go through it. Amen. And come out on the other end. Because then, and only then, can you say God did it. Amen. Right? It's a great reminder that when God does it, the way that He does it, it's all to His glory. Now, any of you who've ever been around farm animals, the first thing I ever noticed, I remember as a kid, I used to go to the state fair in Kentucky. It was in Louisville. It was called, it was some kind of fairgrounds, but it was massive. And I used to go, I always went to the animals. I had never seen cows up close or other animals. But the first thing you notice when you get around farm animals is what? The fragrance. Right? There's a fragrant smell, especially of animals. Now each animal smells differently. You know, pigs are just so stink. But you could imagine being in close proximity. That's a locked ark. There's no windows. There's no fans. You can't turn the AC on. Right? You can imagine that fragrance of not just the animals, but the humans. Don't take a bath for 3 or 4 days. Or 4 days. And you wonder why your friends don't come around no more, right? Go for weeks. Weeks, and you're tending to animals who also cannot get out. They can't go anywhere. And they're being animals. That's what animals do. You know, I got a puppy that she doesn't understand that there's a place for some things, and you know, in certain places you're not supposed to do it. She hasn't learned that yet. She's getting there. But the point is that I can imagine it was a little uncomfortable. Maybe after time they got immune to it, but it was a little uncomfortable. And the reason I'm saying all this, how does that apply to His end time people? This is a follow-up from last week's message, the church. Luke 17:26 says this, "And as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all." In other words, the world is going to continue on until the very last day. And people will be so concerned with their pleasures or their stresses or whatever it is in life that they won't see the Lord coming. They won't care. They'll be so involved in whatever things they're involved in. Their life things that they don't concern about God. That will come on them. You remember, like it says, a thief in the night. It talks about. But the fact is that our three angels' message is a message that the end of all flesh is coming. That the earth is going to be destroyed not by water this time, but by fire. So you guys shouldn't have to turn to this, but if you want to, you can. Revelation 13:18 says this, "Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, 'Fear God and give glory to Him, for the hour of His judgment has come, and worship Him who made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and the springs of water.'" Just like Noah, we are given a message of repentance. That there's a place that God needs us to go to be saved from the impending destruction. It is not the easiest message. You know, if God had given us a message of, "Hey, tell everybody there's a party," we'd like that, right? We go around to people we didn't know. "Hey, there's a party tonight. We're going to have a big time." But what message did He give us? The end's coming. The end's coming. Just like Noah had to preach it for 120 years. He preached that message over and over and over again. And I always ask this question, how many listened? How many? How many outside of his immediate family was in the ark? Zero. And that always made me sad. I always think, you know, I said earlier, you know, talking about the church members, the conference, all those people that were lost. People he had fellowshiped with. Can you imagine? Can you imagine closing that door and desperately wondering, where are they? Where are these people? Where's my best friend? He's not going to come? We've had fellowship for years. They're not going to get on the boat with me? What about those people that we talked to, just last week, talked to them about God? They're not coming either? What about that brother that was baptized in the seminar? He's not going to come? How heavy this message is for us. And we should be able to relate to Noah. It's not an easy message to give. Which brings me to the next point. What is his ark that he wants us to get into for the end times? So follow up from last week's message. The church. The church is his end time ark. The church is the container that he wants us in to get us through to the last times. And again, remember last week we defined the church as those who are, remember in the Revelation it talks about that worship Him in spirit and in truth. I'm not talking about the building. I don't mean that you get into the building and you're going to be saved. I'm talking about that you have a relationship with Christ. Amen. That is part of the church. But His church is the end time ark. Remember, He designed it. He said the gates of Hades will not overcome it, or shall not prevail over it. Hades being death. This is the vehicle that He created to get us through to the end. It's His church. And we've seen from history in the last 2,000 years that Satan has tried everything to destroy the church. He has employed deception. He has employed... we were branded as heretics. We were put under the Inquisition. We have had nations try to snuff us out and kill us all. And what has happened? It has continued to grow. Despite of all that. God built it to last, but only if it's designed in His manner. If you would turn with me to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16, verse 13. Just like the ark got us through, got them through the tough times, the waters, the floods, the destruction, and got them to the end where God had promised they would be saved. His church will get us to the end, to the other side. Starting with verse 13, Matthew 16. It says, when Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, He asked His disciples, saying, who do men say that I am? Or say that I, the Son of Man, am? So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. He said to them, but who do you say that I am? Simon Peter answered and said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. His church was built to last. Amen. Now we think sometimes it's falling apart. We hear it shaking, we hear it rattling, we see people that are amongst us that seems like there's been no conversion, there's no change. We come week in and week out and some people just never really commit to Christ. We see this all the time, but God built His church to last. Just like when Elijah went, remember he told God, he said, I alone am left. And God said, no, you're not. I've got 7,000 reserved. Sometimes we feel, again, that the church is falling apart. And I've said this before, I believe in the end times, that the structure, the legal entity may not be here, but God's people will still be here. Because God designed it that way, and God told us we will be through the end. It will be fellowship that gets us through. Because we will have people in all nations on this planet, in all kingdoms on this planet, that love the Lord more than death. If you read the story, I was hearing about Anne Frank a couple of days ago, and how when the Nazis would go from door to door and house to house and would arrest Jews and put them in concentration camps, there was always families that would hide them, German families that would hide some of these folks and risk death themselves. Right? And some of these people survived until this day. They can give testimonies of how they were a little girl and this family risked their life to protect them. God gave us a church, and regardless of what happens externally, regardless of what happens legally or secularly with our governments, no matter what kind of persecution they bring upon us, death threats and decrees and all these things, we will survive to the end. God has promised us that. But some observations about His ark, the church. John 15:12 through 13 says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." There is a fellowship amongst believers that the world cannot understand. When I was in the world, we had things in common. Maybe we liked the same beer, the same team. Maybe we were involved in the same sins. There was the commonality amongst sinners. But we Christians have something special in common. We have the blood of Christ running through our veins. Right? We have His salvation. We have something that transcends ethnicity. It goes past DNA. It goes past all these things. It's deeper than that. We were bought by the blood of Christ. We were redeemed. We have something that's eternal, that will exist through all eternity. We will have a fellowship that the angels don't have. We'll have a fellowship that even the unfallen worlds of other beings do not have. We'll have a testimony that only we share. There will be a subset of us in heaven that are able to communicate to one another and understand that. Other beings may not understand that. But we'll have that. We'll have that fellowship because we went through it together. Christ gave us the commission to love one another and protect each other. Just like He gave the commission to Noah. He was in charge of protecting what was left of the animals, what was left of the humans. The second observation is this, that Christ Himself gave the pattern for the church. Now, we talked about this last week. Now, man has inserted himself, right? Now, let me read this, and then I'll comment on this. But it's 1 Corinthians 12, if you guys will turn there. 1 Corinthians 12, this is Paul speaking. And it's interesting because it talks about the authority of where the church came from. Starting with verse 12, it says this, "For as the body is one, has many members, but all members of that one body, being many, are one body, so also in Christ, is Christ. For by one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, whether Jews or Greeks, whether slaves or free, and have all been made to drink of one Spirit. For in fact the body is not one member, but many." God's church is diverse. We're all part of the church. He designed it that way. Sometimes we don't like that. Sometimes when He talks, remember it talks about the hand and the feet having different functions. Sometimes we think, well, that doesn't have as an important a function as this. I used to think that musicians were the most important part of the church. I still partly think that. I love music. But the point is that God Himself gave the pattern. And if we stick to the pattern He gave us, we're okay. It's when we vary from that pattern. When we tell Jesus, I appreciate the input. But again, on page 3, I think maybe if we do it a little differently, that things will work out better. And this is what has happened. And we have this a little different than any other Christian church, is that we think that we know better than God sometimes. And we try to change things, or we try to organize things better than He's already organized it. I don't know how you can add to perfection other than make it imperfect. But as long as we stick to the pattern, we're okay. The other observation is this. There is a mix of righteous and unrighteous in the ark, in the body. Matthew 13:30 says this, "Let them grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time I will say to the reapers, First gather together the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Just like Noah had to bring the clean and the unclean in, there are wheat and tares in our congregations. We have to expect that. You know, I was reading a quote from Ellen White. I wish I had written it down, but she effectively said this, is that people go into church thinking that they're going to find perfection. And they find the same rotten stuff that goes on in the world. And you hear me rail against this sometimes, and I think as leadership and stuff like that, we should. We should call into account the body. But the fact is that we have a mix. We have people God's trying to save. People God has already saved and they're a work in progress. And we have to realize that. This is why He said what? We should love one another. Because when we love one another, it's a lot easier. It's when we stop loving, then all of a sudden the church takes on a different meaning. Because then we start pointing out faults. Well, brother so-and-so was doing this, and sister so-and-so said this, and friends, I'm guilty of this too. But the fact is, when you have that foundation of love and you follow the pattern of Christ, then you understand the intention He had for the church. It was not to be perfect like we think perfect is. Our perfection comes from His righteousness. Now you can imagine, some of us sometimes think that we can go before God by our own merit. I had a pretty good week. I didn't lie, steal, or cheat that much. I think I could stand before You and I'd be okay. But no, it's Christ. Christ stands in our place, fortunately. And once we realize that we're all on the same level, that God had to redeem all of us, that He paid the same price for all of us, then we can look at our brother and sister that's struggling, or we can look at our brother or sister who's not quite there yet and have compassion. And maybe, just maybe, we can help them get there. That's what fellowship's about. Easier said than done, right? One of the other observations is this. The animals and the people shared the same food. I thought that was interesting. And the reason I think this is interesting is in John 6:35, it says, "And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." In His end-time arc, the church, there was never supposed to be hierarchy. We all eat of the same bread, which is Christ. Now some churches, I'm not going to name them like Catholic Church, teaches that only certain things can be understood by a certain elite folks, right? The priests. Only the priests can interpret the Bible. And they will tell you what it says. But that's not how God designed His church. God designed His church where everybody eats the same bread. Everybody has access to the same Word. That way when I get up here, or a pastor gets up here, or a PhD gets up here, or Joe, whoever gets up here, you don't need to be a certain level or have a certain understanding. All you have to do is say, is what you're saying according to the Bible. Bobby, you have the same Bible I have, right? And all you have to do is look at it and say, well, is he saying what's in here? If it's not in here, then there's a problem. We share the same food. And He designed this for a couple. I believe that God designed it this way for a few reasons. I believe part of it is to hold us into account. If you remember the nation of Israel, what happened? Their educators, their elite, started to interpret the Bible the way they wanted to, and then they disseminated that to the general public, and they added error, right? So God opened it up to everybody. And I think part of it was to hold us to account. When leaders get up to speak, they don't need to just trust whatever's said. They can say, God said it right here. The Bible is one of the most precious gifts God's ever given to us. And the fact that He opened it up, that He preserved it, so we could all read it. We could see for ourselves what it says. We could see the words of Jesus for ourselves. Martin Luther had to go to a special university to be able to see the Scripture directly. It wasn't available to everybody. And when he began to read it, what happened? He realized that what he was taught and what God said were two different things. And a Reformation happened. And people started reading their Bibles in their own language and realizing when they went to their churches, when they went to their services, that things weren't told like they were in the Bible. And they started holding to account the priests, the preachers, the pastors. Oh, friends, I wish we would do this more. We've lost that. We've lost that. People stop reading their Bibles again. I don't know, maybe because it's too available now. Read your Bible. You don't need me to tell you or Pastor Tim to tell you what it says. Read for yourself. Then when I get up here and there's a discrepancy, you can come to me after and say, "Brother, I don't think it says this." Which, by the way, I appreciate every comment. Another observation is this, that the gates of Hades shall not overcome it. We read this already. It says, "And I shall say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." In other words, it is fireproof. It is waterproof. It is missile proof. It is drone strike proof. It doesn't matter what they bring against it. Remember, it says, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." It doesn't matter what they do to us. They can fine us. They can revoke our non-profit status. They can say you're no longer an organization. They can put us in jail. They can put us in prison. They can try to kill us, or they can kill some of us. But God's church will still remain. They can't kill all of us. They can try. And I believe this verse was directed at Christians from that time forward, because Satan has tried to kill us. He really has. And yet we still remain. And we know in the end times that it's going to be the biggest push ever in the history to destroy God's people. And this is why God will bring us through it. This is why our brothers and sisters don't understand when they talk about the secret rapture and us going off someplace and going to heaven. They don't understand one of His biggest miracles in the history of mankind will be taking us through this time. And at the end of it, when God's people are still standing, even though Satan was unleashed and all his demons and all the kingdoms of the earth marched against us, that we still stood there because God protected us. Just like the ark. Just like the ark, it was protected until the very end, until they were able to get out on the other side and start their new life. We will get out on the other side and start our new life, because salvation will be at the end of the journey, and God will get us through it. The last thing is this: the ark stinks. It stinks. You know, if you're far away from something, if you don't get too close, or you're not too observant, or you keep your distance, everything seems great. But you get in the middle of us Christians, you'll find out that there's a fragrance. And it's not always pleasant. That we're a bunch of screw-ups sometimes. We're a bunch of knuckleheads. That even those of us who have walked with God for a long time, sometimes we make silly mistakes. That we're stupid. Like sheep. There's a reason that that Jesus is called shepherd. And we're called sheep. He could have picked a lot of other animals. He could have said goats or cows or pigs. He picked sheep. And what are sheep known for? They're high IQs, right? They're the intellectual animal, right? They're the ones that get it the first time or the second time or the 15th time. No. They're known for doing something over and over again, and because they're not that bright. That would sum up His people sometimes. We're not that bright. That's why we need God, right? That's why we need the pattern. Because if He didn't spell it out for us, we would do our own thing, and who knows how it would turn out. It would turn out bad, right, Bobby? I always think that sometimes he could have referred to us as donkeys. That might have been more appropriate. But the fact is that it stinks sometimes. But it's the method of His salvation. It's what's bringing us to the end. And yeah, it has its troubles. We'll get aggravated with each other. We'll wonder, why in the world is brother so-and-so doing that? Or why is so-and-so's sister doing that? Or what was he thinking when he said that? Or she said that? There's going to be that. But when you follow the pattern that Christ gave us and you have love as the foundation, it'll get us through it. If you don't have love, then you're going to have a hard time. You're going to end up out. And that's why I'll close with this. This is John 13:34 again. It says, "And a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." If you notice in that verse, he says, love one another as I have loved you. Not as how you want to love somebody else. Not as how you think you should love somebody else. But follow the pattern that Christ has given. And love your fellow man or woman in the church the same way that He loved us. The fact is, if we follow the pattern that God gave us, just like Noah did, to the letter, we're going to make it to the other side. The fact is that when Noah got out of that ark, was there violence in the world? Was there sin at the time? No. They came out to a place and they got to reset. They got to restart. Now granted, sin was still there lurking. And it came about again. But at the end of our journey, His end time people will never experience this again. We'll get to reset. We'll be called home. Where there's no more need for an ark. There's no more need for that type of salvation. That will be in the presence of God forever. And that's the end of His journey. He's just trying to get us there. And this is the means in which, and the vehicle in which He's put into place, that's indestructible, as long as we follow the pattern He gave us. And Bobby, you know, when we sit up in heaven and we're all singing and playing the guitar, that's all I ask for. I just want a new voice. A new voice and give me a little bit better rhythm. That's all I ask for, Lord. And then I can sit with Bobby and Uncle Charlie and everybody and Charles and play in heaven. And we can sit and we can talk about the things that God gave us through. Because I can tell you right now, the testimony that we have on this earth, this end time people, we always talk about how we want to go meet Paul, we want to meet David and all these other people. They're going to want to meet us. The disciples want to meet us. Can you tell us what happened? Can you tell us the end of the story? We didn't get to see it. We'll be able to tell our testimonies to Paul, our testimonies to Peter. We'll be able to sit before King David and say, you wouldn't believe how the earth got, but you know what? God got us through it. And we'll be able to tell them all the stories that God delivered, and we'll be able to share that testimony. And only we'll have it. And I'm looking forward to that day. I'm looking forward to the day that we can look back and say, it was rough, it stunk sometimes, it rattled, it shook, we thought we weren't going to make it, but God got us through. Amen. Amen. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for that you do everything in your power to save us, that you don't give up on us, that regardless of the silliness that we portray sometimes in our lives and some of the things that go on in the body of Christ, that you still love us, that you still work with us, that you still fine-tune us so that we'll be good citizens in heaven. So I ask that you bless the rest of our Sabbath. Amen.